So when I was growing up, my dad's been very pivotal in who I am as a person. And he always told me that success isn't measured by how well you climb the mountain. Getting the mountaintop is just one part. Success is truly when you reach back and you help others also climb that mountain. It's been a saying that's colored my life for most of it. There's some years there we won't talk about. So when I moved to Green Bay, one of the first things I did was I found a way to be involved. I went on the internet because it is 2017, and I found a listing for hospice can pass us. And a nice woman named Karen, who's here today, talked to me in a dining facility, and we kind of talked a little about what was expected and to meet with clients and things like that, so I agreed to do it. Before I move that story, I guess it's important to tell you who I am, other than that beautiful introduction. But I am a man of color. I'm a very proudly Latino from California. I am an Army vet, and unlike many Army vets, I am very liberal. And I also married a white woman, and that will make a difference later on. So in this process, I met with many different patients. Most of them were nonverbal. Most of them were on their way out. And I mostly read books to them. And then I honored their service. And when they passed, I took it in. I wouldn't say I wept or anything like that, but everybody dies. And it's the way I've always kind of operated in my life. And that's part of the Army. But so eventually I was paired with a man named Steve, which is not his real name. No worries, Karen. And so I remember going to the first meeting with Steve and Karen, and we sat down in a room, and Steve was not very apologetic or short about his political beliefs and the way he saw the world. And it was a very long half an hour. I remember standing up and walking out with Karen to my car, and Karen said, "Can you do this?" And I kind of looked at her, and I said, "Yes." In my mind, thinking that I am more stubborn than Steve is, and I know that. So what followed was 2 months of me sitting with Steve, and Steve every week telling me how Californians are terrible, and how I probably shouldn't have married my wife, and the reasons why, and all the different ways that I offended him. And every day I walked out. And so after a while, and I remember this, I walked in that hallway, and it was the same muted brown color that's this carpet. This is much nicer, though. And the hallway's just, it was dark and dim, and it smelled like death. I'm not sure if you've smelled that before, but it's very, very pungent, and once you smell it once, it sits with you, and it hangs. I remember standing in front of his door many a day for probably longer than I should have, 1 to 2 minutes, 3 minutes before knocking and coming in. Steve was very senile, so when I walked in the door, he'd always say, "Who is it?" And I'd say, "Franco." And then I'd hear the disappointment in his voice, and he said, "Okay." So I go sit in the room, and I am embarrassed to say this, but I was filled with hate. And I think hate is just another word for ignorance, but I hated Steve. I hated being there. I hated going every week. It was hard, and it made me feel small. It made me feel smaller than I feel sometimes in this community, being a man of color from a different place. But he really highlighted it. But I kept going back because, and this again is very dark, I figured Steve would die, because that's what hospice is. And so I continued and kept going back over and over again, knowing that no one should die alone, even when you don't agree with them. So eventually, we'd have these ideological arguments, and I would start to stand up for myself more and more, because, again, I am very stubborn and flawed. Then a funny thing happened. He started to talk to me after we finished. And I remember him handing me a yearbook and showing me a picture he'd taken. Or we would talk about how we both loved boxing, and he boxed when he was younger and met a famous boxer that he'd since forgot the name of. Maybe. And then he used to talk to me about my wife and his wife and our problems we have with marriage, and it was fascinating. He offered me this one bit of advice. He's been married for many years to many different women, and he feels like he's only ever had one argument. It started the night of the wedding, and it's continued ever since. But things like that were really pearls of knowledge. And in our arguments, he always left me this one saying, and it's that we're all just in a movie theater, and you walk in well after the movie started, and we'll all leave before it ends. And it really, really stuck with me. And I remember we had this one conversation right after that where Steve was telling me how his wife was switching hospice facilities, or not hospice facilities, but different assisted living homes, and she was gonna have a really hard time moving. And I said, "Steve, just let my wife and I know the address and we'll help you move." And there was a heavy, heavy silence. So much so I think you probably could have watched like a tumbleweed roll by very dramatically. And eventually Steve kind of looked at me, and looks a misnomer, but in my direction, and said, "You would do that?" And I looked at Steve and I said, "Yeah, we're friends." And then just a lot of silence went by, and he said, "I guess we are." So I went back to my car that day, and A smarter man could probably tell you how what this was, but I felt something. I'm not sure it was fulfillment or connection, but something. And then 2 days later, I got a phone call from Karen letting me know that Steve was going to die. And I immediately got in my car, and I raced to somewhere in Green Bay. This whole place is confusing to me. And I remember running through that hallway that I didn't want to go through and pushing through the door that I always hated to go into. And I walked in the room, and his family was there, and it was very clear I was not the person they wanted to see walk in that door. And it was a very short conversation, and they said that he was resting and that he wasn't going to be responsive, that I probably should just go, and they thanked me, and I said, thank you, and I started to walk out the door, and then I heard the very familiar, "Who is that?" And it was Steve. And I said, "It's Franco." And he, again, sounded disappointed somewhat, and he said, "Come here." And so I walked over to the bed, and Steve shook my hand, and he said, "Hello, Franco." "Goodbye, Franco." And then I walked out. And now, if you know me, I'm not a man of immense emotional depth. This is kind of what you get all the time. But I went to my car, and I wept, and in a way that I have never experienced. In the Army and in life, I've been around depth. I've lost my family, parts of my family. But never have I felt so much for one human being, and I don't know how or why to this day. But Steve taught me something very important. I think this is what community service is. It's learning from people. We think we're giving, but really it's an exchange. And it's that it is so fundamentally easy to hate. I think the hard part is letting love enter when none was possible before. Thank you.